Hi, in this lesson, we'll take a look at data types. So far, we've only used numerical values inside our variables. But what if we wanted to use a variable that held text, like a color name, for example? In order to use different types of information, we'll need to understand what data types are. A data type is the classification we give to a value based on the information it contains. In this course, we're going to focus on 4 data types, though many others exist, and you'll learn about more of them as you continue learning Python. The data types we're going to look at are strings, integers, floating point numbers, and Booleans. Let's dive into each of these a bit deeper. A string, or str, is a sequence of characters. Now, these can be any characters we wish. We can use upper and lowercase letters, spaces between words, special characters, numbers, and even nothing, which we call an empty string. Any of these characters can be included in our string values. The most important thing to remember about strings is that all of the text must be surrounded by a set of either single or double quotation marks. Integers, or ints, are whole numbers. Some examples you can probably guess are 100, 25, 0, and -36. Positive, negative, and 0 values can all be integers. Would this value be considered an integer? Because this number is surrounded by quotation marks, it would actually be a string data type. Integers are not surrounded by any quotation marks. What about this value? Well, integers have to be whole numbers, so if there is a decimal point included in the value, it is actually considered a floating point number, which we'll talk about in a second. Integers do not have decimal points included. A floating point number, or a float, is a number that does include a decimal point in its value. Some examples we can think of are 3.14, 2.0, 0.0, and -50.23. Our floats can be positive, negative, or 0, just like our integers, but they must include a decimal point. So, do we think 82 would be a float? No, this is an integer data type because it does not include a decimal point. What about this value? Just like in our last slide, we learned that anything surrounded by quotation marks is a string, so this would be considered a string, not a float. The last data type we're going to learn about is the Boolean, or bool. We're going to dive much deeper into Booleans in the next module, but let's just take a second to learn what they are so we're familiar with them. Booleans are true or false values. So the only examples for a Boolean are true or false. Booleans can only be one of these two options. So is this a Boolean? Just like with our numerical examples, anything surrounded by quotation marks is a string. So this is not a Boolean value. What about this value? This one is tricky, but this value will actually give us an error if we try to use it in a program. The first letter of a Boolean value must be capitalized or it is not considered a Boolean. Again, we'll use this data type much more in the next module, so this is all we'll learn about Booleans for now. Let's go back to our other 3 data types: strings, integers, and floating point numbers. Why does the data type even matter anyway? Well, there are certain tasks that can only be performed with values of specific data types. For example, we need to use numerical values, which are ints or floats, for many of our mathematical operations. So using a string of the value 5 in this expression will not work. Note that there are some mathematical expressions that can be used with strings, and we'll look at one of them in the next lesson. Another example is that when we print text, our data types need to match one another, which we'll look at in more detail in a few lessons. In this lesson, we learned about 4 different data types that can be used in our programs. Before we learn about more things we can do with these data types, complete a few activities to check your understanding.